Welcome to this presentation. We're going to be covering Chapter 2 of our textbook today, and this chapter will cover the topic of ethics in a business context and the closely associated idea of social responsibility. So let's get started. Here are some vocabulary words that we'll be talking about today and that are covered in that textbook chapter. You can see that they're in red, so these are terms that you want to be sure to become familiar with because they're likely to be a source of testing as we go forward in the semester. Of course, a chapter about ethics, we're going to want to define the term ethics naturally. And of course, that is, in this context, the study and practice of decisions about what is good or right. In other words, values. And I think most of us have a sense as to what values are, but those are abstractions that capture our sense of what is good and desirable. Ethics and values aren't universal. People have differing life experiences, differing cultural references, sometimes religious references that cause us to view ethics and values in a different way. Certainly over the passage of time, different cultures, and even the same culture at different points in time have looked at ethics and values, have defined what is good and what is right differently than maybe they do today. Perhaps some people in our class define those terms differently. I'm sure that would be the case. And so these aren't questions that we can consider once and come up with an answer that's going to be the universal answer, or be the one that we all agree to. Moreover, it's likely that as we have new life experiences, that our sense about what is good and what is right, what our values are, is likely to change over time. And so it's important, I think, to have a certain level of we'll say, modesty perhaps, or a certain level of deference when we talk about this, open to the idea that we can learn from others, that we can see something about their insights by listening to their perspectives. The field of ethics isn't just one monolithic field. When I am working with my paralegal students, we talk a lot about legal ethics, and that's a very different notion than what we're talking about here. Because in the law, there are very defined problems that the legal community has decided these are the answers to these problems. Sometimes legal professionals agree wholeheartedly with those answers that the legal community has arrived at. Other times, a legal professional might say, I think that between those maybe competing values, maybe the wrong decision has been made. But whether the legal professional agrees with it or not, the legal professional needs to follow those legal ethical rules. Of course, some legal ethical rules do allow for there to be differing evaluations, differing priorities. I don't want to make it sound like everything is cut and dried, but there's much more of that than we will see in the business ethics area. And so if you've dealt in other disciplines with ethics, you may be surprised to hear that business ethics doesn't give you a lot of answers. It more often asks you questions and kind of leaves that in your hands to sort through the dilemmas that you'll face as a business professional. Okay, so let's look at the term ethical dilemma, and that's when we have a question. We're trying to decide how to resolve a discrete problem that we've encountered in the business world. And the reality is that most business people are going to encounter ethical dilemmas probably every day of their professional lives, certainly on a weekly basis, if not more. There will be dozens of times where you will confront an issue about whether how you're going to handle a customer, how you're going to handle an employee, how you're going to handle a manager, someone whom you work for, how you are going to resolve a supplier issue. All of those things involve issues other than ethics, but they certainly also involve ethics. Another related issue is, what does our community expect of business? And this is definitely something that changes over time. The ideas that exist today about the responsibilities that business have would be very different than the ideas that people 100 years ago would have had. And maybe 100 years from now, the ideas will be different than what they are today. So there isn't just a one-time, one-size-fits-all answer to this question, but I think it's useful to be aware of those expectations. Doesn't mean that you have to agree with them or that you have to adopt them, but I think it's a good idea. It can be important, for one thing, as a practical matter, because if you are taking actions that are viewed as not satisfying that social responsibility aspect of your business, then it may be that if a lawsuit were to arrive, that the jury members might be more inclined to hold you financially responsible for something, even if, per se, you haven't actually breached that contract or you haven't actually committed a tort. But perhaps more importantly, if the larger community doesn't feel that you're doing the right things, they may be less inclined to use your service or buy your product. Let's go on to the next slide. So here are some values that, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are values that you may want to think about when you are considering ethical dilemmas. This is not an exhaustive list, as I said, and sometimes these values are in tension with one another. You might be able to have freedom, but you can't have justice, or you might be able to have security, but that leads to inefficiencies. And so sometimes it's a trade-off where you pick one over another. Sometimes you try to manage having both at the same time, maybe with both values not being completely satisfied. So let's look at that first value, the idea of freedom. I think we all have a sense about what freedom means: to act without restriction, to possess the capacity to do as you wish, to escape, whatever those challenges are. And certainly these are values, these are good things, assuming that you're not acting irresponsibly when you do these things, but they're inherently good things to think about. And I think many times business people seek the business expression or to express themselves through business because of that feeling of autonomy. Perhaps you decide to become an entrepreneur. One of the big allures of that particular career path is that you get to be very autonomous. You get to make your own decisions. But of course, with that freedom, you're going to find that there are tensions along with that. For example, you may have less security as a result. So what is security? Again, I have little Linus here in the blanket. That's a symbol or an embodiment, I guess, of that idea of security. It's when you feel confident that your needs are going to be met. And certainly it's one of the appeals, for example, of working for a large corporation, or at least historically it has been one of those appeals. Nowadays, with less job security in those types of situations, it perhaps feels a little bit less secure than it might once have felt. Another aspect of security is that you feel safe. You feel like people aren't going to violate your personal integrity and are not going to harm the items that belong to you, and that you feel are things that you should be able to determine what's going to happen with respect to those things. And certainly sometimes when we value freedom, that value we may decide, or we may directly or indirectly be reducing our feeling of security. Or perhaps when we value or honor the freedom of somebody else in an ethical dilemma, we may be compromising either our feeling of security or perhaps their feeling of security. And then we have justice. Justice is one of these ideas that we all find appealing, but what justice means can vary greatly from one person to another. It's a pretty rare person who thinks of himself as unjust, even if perhaps other people would perceive him in that way. And here are some ideas about justice. Again, these are just kind of almost a mosaic of various ideas that you might associate with the term justice. To receive the products of your labor. If you've worked hard on a project, let's say you're in sales, you've worked hard on closing that sale, you want to be sure that you're getting the commission. That's going to make you feel that there has been justice. That's also going to help you feel secure, and it may even help you feel free. But let's say you are claiming a commission that doesn't belong to you, that really somebody else did most of the work. You feel like you can probably get away with claiming it, but you really don't feel entitled to it because someone else really should be earning that. Well, you probably don't feel that's a very just choice, but it may feel like it's going to give you more security. After all, the better you perform in your job, the more likely you are that your employer is going to maintain your employment. And in addition, the more money you have, the more secure you can feel in your financial circumstances. And so sometimes the notion of justice can have tension with that feeling of security. Certainly a related idea of justice is treating folks fairly. And I hesitate to use the word equally here because some people disagree with the idea that we want to treat people equally. So I've just left the word fairly here. Although if you want to add equally, certainly you can in your own mind. And what does it mean to be fair? What does it mean to treat people fairly across these various categories? Again, this goes back to the idea of ethics and values, and what somebody in 1817 thought was fair, it might be very different than what somebody in 1953 thinks is fair, and certainly what people think today is fair. To provide resources in proportion to need, and again, this idea of need, you could also change and say to provide resources in proportion to the amount of work that a person has done, or the value of the contribution that person has made. And so those are some ideas about justice that, again, can have some tension with our other values that we've been discussing. And then we have the idea of efficiency. This is the last of the 4 values we'll be talking about here, but certainly not a full list of the values. And this is one that's maybe more geared toward business than any of the others. Certainly, we want to maximize the wealth in society, but probably more importantly, we want to maximize the wealth of our business and want to maximize our personal wealth. And we also want to minimize the costs associated with that. And you can see that there can be tension with some of our other values. If we maximize the profits that we have and minimize costs, it might not be the most just solution. If we minimize costs, maybe that means we lay people off. And maybe as a result of this, then other people are not feeling financially secure. And they don't feel free to pursue the activities that they want to because of their life circumstances. So all these ideas, there's some tension associated with it. You can't accomplish all of these values 100% in all circumstances. Of course, whenever we talk about ethics, it's natural to talk about the law, and I've already talked a little bit about legal ethics, but really when I was talking about legal ethics before, I was talking about it from the perspective of a legal professional. As a business person, your primary connection is with legal ethics is likely to be not with the type of ethics I was talking about, but what does the law require of us? What are the tasks that we must do or we must not do under the law? And certainly that is a kind of a floor for our activities. We have to satisfy that. We obviously aren't behaving ethically if we don't comply with the law. But that really is just the floor. Hopefully, our ethical sense will motivate us to achieve a higher level of ethics than simply complying with the bare bones of the law. It's necessary to comply with the law, but it's not sufficient. We aren't an ethical person simply by complying with the law. We need to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We're going to talk about a way of looking at the ethical choices that we are going to face, and the approach that the textbook talks about is WH. I remember this by thinking White House. Not that it has anything to do with the White House, but just the WH reminds me of White House. So might be a little mnemonic that you use as you prepare for the test. And of course, as you can see here, it's in red, so you're going to want to remember what the WH approach is. And what does the W stand for? Well, it stands for whom, and then the H stands for how. Okay, and so this is a way of looking. This is a paradigm. You may recall in Chapter 1 we talked about the notion of paradigms. Again, paradigms are ways of looking at the world. It's a way of making connections between facts that we know and putting those facts together to tell a story, to have a picture of reality. You know, our paradigm in really any discipline that we work in is going to evolve, and it's going to grow. It's going to become more sophisticated and more complex as we get more data, more experience in that particular area. And the same would apply for our ethical sense. And so let's look at how the WH approach could facilitate that paradigm development. So what we do, we consider, with the WH approach, we consider whom the action affects, what are the purposes of that action, how the business person should view its morality. And again, the WH approach is just an ethical guideline. There's lots of ethical guidelines. This is just one. Obviously, if you find a different one more aesthetically pleasing or more helpful or more practical, and that's what you ought to use. But for this course, this is the one that we're going to talk about. So we're first of all going to consider whom does this decision affect? And the key term here that many times people talk about are stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders in this decision? In other words, who has a stake or who has a skin in this game? Who has a dog in this fight? Who has who bears some risk or may experience some benefit based upon this decision? And then finally, how should we make this decision? How should we look upon this decision? And of course, what decision should we end up making? So let's consider stakeholders. There can be lots and lots of different stakeholders in a situation, and it's useful to consider them all. Historically, business people have thought about the stakeholders being the owners or investors of the business, and certainly they are important stakeholders. But nowadays, people typically think about other people as also being stakeholders. Some of these people may be stakeholders indirectly. You may say, well, I'm not so concerned about consumers as stakeholders. But the reality is, if you don't consider them as stakeholders, well, are they going to continue to want to consume your product or use your service if you aren't considering the impact that your product and your decisions have on those folks? And so, and of course, if you neglect your consumers and they stop buying your product, well, then the value of your business plummets, and who's going to be upset at that point? The owners and the investors of the business. Of course, you'll have the role of as being in management once you've established yourself in your career, and so you will have some self-interest there in considering your role as a stakeholder. But this is a larger universe than just you, of course, unless you are an entrepreneur. There will be other people in management, maybe people in other divisions or other locations who can be affected by the decision. Then we have employees. Now, let me pause here and say that, of course, managers are also employees. So really, when I use the term employees in this context, I'm talking about a subdivision of all employees, the non-management employees. Very likely at this point in your life, you are an employee more than a manager in whatever position you have right now. Most of us in our early years are in that mode, less so than being in management. And so you're probably familiar with that position, and you certainly obviously want your manager to be considering you when he or she makes decisions. And then, of course, the larger community. The community may include all of the people we've already talked about: consumers, owners, management, employees, but it may include people in addition to those categories. For example, let's imagine that you have a factory and your factory has smokestacks that pollute. And your pollution may be affecting the neighborhood that is close to your smokestacks. The people in that neighborhood may not necessarily fit into these categories, but they're affected by decisions that you make in terms of how you run your smokestacks. And then finally, future generations. Obviously, if you pollute or do things along those lines, it's possible that the impacts could be greater than what's happening today. So those are groups that you may want to consider, and that maybe the larger society expects you to consider. So we've talked about the W in WH, and now we're going to move on to the H. And that is how. How are we going to consider these people? How are we going to come up with a worldview that's going to allow us to make wise decisions that are wise both from a business perspective and also from an ethical perspective? The textbook talks about 3 lenses through which we can look at these issues. The first is the golden rule. Most of us will have been familiar with this term. We may not have heard that name before, but it's a pretty common way of looking at it. The other 2 rules are perhaps less common, but we'll talk about those as well. When we're looking at any of these 3 rules, we're going to consider the stakeholders. Let me flip back. We're going to be considering these groups of people. And of course, this isn't an either-or situation. Just as when we were talking stakeholders, we're going to consider all the groups when we're making an ethical decision. It's very likely that we will want to think in terms of all 3 of these choices and maybe even other guidelines before we make our final decision about what makes most sense in this particular circumstance. Let's look at the first one of these ethical guidelines, the golden rule. There's lots of different ways of describing the golden rule. The one that I grew up hearing as somebody who grew up in the Christian faith is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And this is kind of a paraphrased version of that. But of course that golden rule is not at all unique to Christianity. Many different faith communities have something very similar within their tradition. And it may be phrased differently, but at the end of the day, it has a very similar meaning. Below are 5 other ways that you might want to look at it, if you find these perhaps a little bit more to your taste. And certainly you can customize the idea behind the golden rule in whatever way that makes it the most sense to you. But the idea is you're putting yourself into the position of the stakeholder and saying, how would I want to be treated if I were the consumer? How would I want to be treated if I were the investor? How would I want to be treated if I were the manager? How would I want to be treated if I were the employee? How would I want to be treated if I were a member of that larger community? How would I want to be treated if I were a member of that future generation? And that's a way of thinking about it. You know, you may actually fit into some of those categories, so you may know exactly how you would feel. But in some cases, you won't be part of those categories. So we're going to go to that third test. So let me just go back here and we'll see here. We've covered the golden rule. We're now going to go to that public disclosure test. So what is the public disclosure test? Well, this requires a little bit of imagination here. By the way, the picture I have here is in the old-timey television. Many of y'all won't even recognize this as a television, but this is once upon a time what televisions look like before color, and they were very similar in terms of structure. I'm just barely old enough to kind of sort of remember this. Anyway, this was during the Watergate hearings. I was just a little bitty kid at this point in time, but it took over the whole television. That was the only thing on television all day long as the hearings were on. And we would, I wasn't watching, I was a little kid, but I was aware that the hearings were on, and my parents would watch them from time to time. They were, of course, to a little kid, very, very boring. I wanted to see cartoons, but it left an impression upon me because everything was out there. Things people did in secret weren't secret anymore. And I'm sure many of the people that testified were thinking to themselves, if only I had known that I would end up on television with all of America watching and have to answer these probing and embarrassing questions, I might have made different choices. And so here's the takeaway. If when we make an action, we should consider what would it be like if our action were broadcast on television for the whole world to see. If all those stakeholders that we were previously making decisions that affected, if they were to see what our answers are, if they were to see what our decisions were and how we went about making the decisions, would we feel proud? Would we feel ashamed? what would be our reaction? And if we would, in fact, feel ashamed if the world knew, perhaps we ought to consider taking a different action. This is actually a piece of advice that attorneys pretty routinely give their clients. Before you say something or do something, typically what an attorney will say is, imagine if you have to testify to it in front of a group of 12 people who will be determining your fate, either in a civil or criminal context. And so if you prefer to think of it not so much as being on television, but you being in the witness chair having to explain that, that's another way of looking at that situation. And then, let me go back here. So now we've talked about the golden rule, and we've talked about the public disclosure test. Now we're going to look at the final test, which is the universalization test. This perhaps is my favorite, at least in terms of practical issues. This is one in which you consider what would happen if everybody acted the way you're about to act. You know, if we sit back and think, well, it's okay if I do it because I'm only one person, okay, that's fine, but everyone else is only one person. And if they all make that same choice, where will we end up? I was an economics major in college, and those of you all that have taken economics have probably heard of the idea of the tragedy of the commons. And this is the idea that if you have, say, historically, the commons was an area wherein people from the community, it was a public area wherein people in the community could bring their livestock to graze. And it belonged to everybody, and so in some sense it belonged to nobody, because people who used it didn't have any particular reason to take good care of it, because after all, it didn't belong to them. And so people would overgraze the land. And part of the idea was, well, why shouldn't I graze it? I can graze here for free. And if I don't graze it, somebody else will graze it, and they will overgraze the land, and it won't be available for me. So I might as well be the one overgrazing it. Anyway, that's the idea behind the tragedy of the commons, that people were not applying this universalization test. So to consider how that might play out. So, you know, for example, if you're thinking to yourself, well, maybe I'll just go ahead and lie to that customer about it. Well, okay, you can lie and maybe you'll get away with it. But what if everybody lied? What kind of world would that be? What kind of changes would that make to how we would function in this society? And what would be the quality of life in such a society? So this, to me, is a meaningful way of looking at that issue, of looking at an ethical guideline. I hope that this has raised some questions for you, and I hope that you'll be sure to bring them in to class or into the discussion boards. Thank you for your time and your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Take care.